This is a summary of the autonomic nervous system that will be important for review for our upcoming exam on the nervous system. As a reminder, we want to look at the nervous system and see how the autonomic nervous system fits in. So when we consider the nervous system, we can divide it up into two major branches: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system includes everything else in the nervous system outside of the brain and spinal cord. You should recall that the peripheral nervous system serves to send sensory information to the central nervous system for integration, and once that information is integrated, a response is sent out to effectors via motor neurons. When we consider the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, we can divide it into two main areas: the somatic nervous system, which helps to send responses to effectors like skeletal muscle and any effector that is voluntarily controlled. And the second branch of the motor part of the peripheral nervous system is called the autonomic nervous system. And that's where our focus is today. Think of the autonomic nervous system as the involuntary motor division of the peripheral nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is responsible for innervating involuntary motor functions. When we consider the autonomic nervous system, we divide it into two major branches: the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is also called the fight or flight system, and that is because we tend to increase function in structures that will be necessary for us to run away from danger or to deal with stressful situations. We call the parasympathetic nervous system the rest and digest system. We could also call it the feed and breathe system, because we find that the parasympathetic nervous system tends to decrease functions in certain structures. When we consider the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system, think of them as antagonists to each other, because with whatever one system will do, the other system will work in opposition to that function. So again, the autonomic nervous system is a division of the peripheral nervous system. In fact, it's a division of the motor part of the peripheral nervous system, and it serves to send signals to involuntary structures once it receives information from the brain and spinal cord. So some of the structures that will be supplied and innervated by the autonomic nervous system are structures in our cardiovascular system, like blood vessels. The heart is modulated or modified by the autonomic nervous system. So remember, the heart has its own intrinsic conduction system, so it tells itself when to beat. However, the autonomic nervous system can modify the way in which the heart beats. Examples of other structures that are affected or supplied by the autonomic nervous system are our digestive system organs, urogenital system organs, so these will include organs that belong to the urinary system and the reproductive or genital system. Respiratory system structures are supplied by the autonomic nervous system. the eye and our glands are also innervated by the autonomic nervous system. Again, the autonomic nervous system has two major divisions. Sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight, and then parasympathetic nervous system, which we like to think of as the rest and digest or feed and breathe system. You should know that because the autonomic nervous system is a branch of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, it only contains motor nerves. Structures that are innervated by the autonomic nervous system are those structures that are under involuntary control. So when we think of involuntary control, think about bodily processes that happen automatically without us having to think about them, such as respiration, digestion, and things such as reflexes, such as defecation and urination. We should remember that the autonomic nervous system does not regulate the cardiac muscle completely. So the heart, again, is different. The autonomic nervous system helps to modulate the heart, and it can cause it to change the way in which it beats, making it beat stronger or with more force or with increased rate, or it can cause, alternatively, decreased heart rate, decreased force of contraction. Let's take a moment to look at the comparison between the somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. When you think of somatic nervous system, think about what we learned when we learned about how skeletal muscle contracts. When we contract structures, voluntary structures like skeletal muscle, we know that a motor neuron is responsible for innervating the structure that we wish to move. So this motor neuron will have a cell body that originates in the central nervous system, and the motor neuron will have axons that will move or come into close proximity with the structure that it will innervate. We saw a good example of this when we looked at how we innervate a muscle like the biceps brachii. In the autonomic nervous system, however, we have a two motor neuron chain. One of these motor neurons comes before the ganglion, and we call it the preganglionic neuron. The other neuron comes after the ganglion, and that is called the postganglionic neuron. Preganglionic neurons will originate either in the brain or spinal cord, whereas postganglionic neurons, no matter where they arise, they extend all of the way to the effector that they innervate. For the most part, most of our body's organs receive supply from both branches of the autonomic nervous system. That means that there will be fibers from both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system that extend to most of our organs. These are a few exceptions that only receive sympathetic fibers. Blood vessels, some of our skin structures, some glands, and most importantly, the adrenal medulla. The diagram in the lower right-hand corner of this slide shows us the adrenal medulla. If you look closely, this is a gland that is located on top of the kidney, and it is divided into two parts. The outer part is called the adrenal cortex, and it makes 3 different types of hormones. Our focus today is on the adrenal medulla, which is the anterior part of this gland. The adrenal medulla produces 2 hormones called epinephrine and norepinephrine, and it's important to note that when we have sympathetic stimulation of the adrenal medulla, it will cause secretion of these hormones. Hormones, again, are chemical messengers from the endocrine system. So we've already established that the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system have antagonistic effects, and that means they work in opposition to each other. We are going to learn about 2 different types of neurotransmitters that are active in the autonomic nervous system. Those neurotransmitters are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. All parasympathetic fibers release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Sympathetic preganglionic fibers also release acetylcholine, whereas sympathetic postganglionic fibers release norepinephrine. Okay, bye-bye. Okay, let's take a closer look at both divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So again, you must know that we call the sympathetic nervous system the fight or flight division, and that's because it tends to increase function in structures that are used in times of stress or when we need to run away from danger. One thing that's important for you to know is that the fibers for the sympathetic nervous system are going to come from the middle of the spinal cord. So they come from the thoracic and lumbar regions. When we put them together, we say that sympathetic nervous system preganglionic fibers come from the thoracolumbar divisions of the spinal cord. When we consider the length of fibers in the sympathetic nervous system, we should know that the fibers that are before the ganglion are very short, whereas those that are after the ganglion extend from the ganglion straight to the target organ or target tissue. Preganglionic fibers in the sympathetic nervous system are very short because the ganglia for the sympathetic nervous system tend to be very close to the spinal cord. Postganglionic fibers will extend from the sympathetic ganglion chains to their target organs or tissues. When we consider neurotransmitters in the sympathetic nervous system, we need to know that preganglionic fibers secrete the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and postganglionic fibers secrete the hormone or neuroendocrine hormone, norepinephrine. Now let's take a look at the sympathetic nervous system. Again, when we talk about the sympathetic nervous system, we can consider it the rest and digest system or the feed and breathe system because it tends to increase function in structures that are involved in digestion or in structures that, for example, the genitalia. When we consider where the fibers for the parasympathetic nervous system come from, they're coming from the top and bottom of the spinal cord. So they originate from the cranium, cranial region, and the sacral region, or we can say that the location is craniosacral. In terms of pre- and postganglionic fibers, we need to know that the preganglionic fibers for the parasympathetic nervous system are long, whereas postganglionic fibers are short. And when we consider the type of neurotransmitter that is used by the parasympathetic nervous system, all preganglionic fibers, whether sympathetic or parasympathetic, will use the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. In fact, we should say they release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And in the parasympathetic nervous system, acetylcholine is released by postganglionic neurons. In some cases, nitric oxide may be released by postganglionic fibers in the parasympathetic nervous system. This diagram helps to illustrate the differentiation between fiber length in the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. So when we examine this diagram, we see that the parasympathetic nervous system has long preganglionic fibers that secrete acetylcholine, short postganglionic fibers that also secrete acetylcholine. Sympathetic nervous system has short preganglionic fibers that release acetylcholine and long postganglionic fibers that secrete norepinephrine. This is yet another diagram that helps us to understand what we see when we consider the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. This diagram also shows us a comparison between the somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system innervation. So let's take a look at the somatic nervous system, which is at the top. In the somatic nervous system, we have a single neuron that runs from the central nervous system directly to the effector organ. This is what we saw when we saw how skeletal muscle contracts. Here we have a multipolar neuron, we have a myelinated axon, and when our electrical impulse gets to the axon terminus, it releases the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Acetylcholine then binds to the postsynaptic membrane of the effector, and the effect is stimulatory. In our case, when we looked at skeletal muscle, that meant that we caused an action potential, we depolarized the membrane of our skeletal muscle, also known as the sarcolemma, and that allowed us to contract our skeletal muscle. When we consider the autonomic nervous system, you need to remember that instead of a single neuron, we have a chain of two neurons that run from the central nervous system to the effector. We're going to take a look at the parasympathetic nervous system, and that is shown at the bottom of the diagram. Again, the parasympathetic nervous system is characterized by long preganglionic fibers, and these long preganglionic fibers release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. It is also characterized by short postganglionic fibers that also secrete the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Acetylcholine will bind to receptors on the target tissue and target organ, and depending on the structure, it may have a stimulatory or inhibitory effect. The sympathetic nervous system also has a two-neuron chain system. Here we see that we have short preganglionic fibers in the sympathetic nervous system, and they release acetylcholine. Postganglionic fibers in the sympathetic nervous system release the neurotransmitter known as norepinephrine. Sympathetic fibers can also innervate or can also stimulate the adrenal medulla to secrete the hormone epinephrine. When it does so, epinephrine is released into the bloodstream, and then it can bind to a target tissue or target organ in order to enact its effect. Now let's take a look at types of receptors that we find in the sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system. So for the parasympathetic nervous system, we know that both pre- and postganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. The receptors that acetylcholine bind to are called cholinergic receptors. So the last part of acetylcholine acts as a prefix for the receptor type that acetylcholine will bind to. Cholinergic receptors bind acetylcholine. In the sympathetic nervous system, we know that our preganglionic neurons will release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. That means that when we have receptors on the postganglionic surface, those receptors will be cholinergic receptors because acetylcholine will bind to them. When we consider receptors on the target tissue for the sympathetic nervous system, those receptors will be binding epinephrine. Epinephrine is the same chemically as adrenaline. Adrenaline is the term that's typically used in British literature, whereas in the United States we use the term norepinephrine, Let me restate that. Epinephrine and adrenaline are the same chemical compound. Norepinephrine and noradrenaline are the same chemical compound. One of these terms tends to be used by the British, while the other is used here in the United States. If we can remember that norepinephrine and noradrenaline are essentially the same chemical compound, that will help us to remember that norepinephrine binds to adrenergic receptors. Okay, norepinephrine binds to adrenergic receptors, and this is because noradrenaline and norepinephrine are the same chemically, and they are closely related to adrenaline and epinephrine. So, norepinephrine binds to adrenergic receptors, and these receptors will be found on the target tissue or they will be found on the effector. When we think of the types of receptors that we have, let's look at adrenergic receptors first. When we consider adrenergic receptors, we have two types, alpha receptors and beta receptors. One thing that we want to make a note of is that alpha 1 receptors are typically excitatory. So that means when norepinephrine binds to the receptors, they will typically stimulate the effect of the receptor. Another important note that we want to remember is that alpha 2 receptors on the pancreas tend to decrease secretion from the pancreas. The pancreas is a gland that is involved heavily in the digestive process. So we want to know that when alpha-2 receptors on the pancreas are stimulated, it causes decreased secretion of hormones from the pancreas. The second type of adrenergic receptor is the beta receptor. And we have 3 types or subtypes of beta receptors: beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. For the most part, beta receptors are excitatory, but you want to make a note that when we find beta 2 receptors in the lungs, they are going to be inhibitory. When we consider cholinergic receptors, we have 2 types: nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors are going to be found on all parasympathetic and sympathetic postganglionic neurons. That means, or that helps us to remember, that preganglionic fibers are going to secrete acetylcholine. Therefore, the receptors on the postsynaptic or postganglionic membrane will be cholinergic receptors, and in particular, they tend to be nicotinic receptors. We see muscarinic receptors on a few sympathetic effectors. For example, we will see them on sweat